All right, one of our favorites back on the show, Nick Knudsen from Read and Reaction. Stand up and holler. Nick, how's it going, man?
SEC Mike, appreciate you having me here. Looking forward to it. It's football season finally. Florida's got Miami coming in the swamp on Saturday. We couldn't be any more fired up.
Well, I have to lead with this, though. This is mostly going to be a Florida discussion, but I'm just curious. How much did you enjoy week 0 with allegedly top 10 Florida State getting embarrassed on national television?
Hey, that's not a bad way to start the season. You know, sometimes you got to live through the pain of your rivals sometimes, especially when you've had enough pain of your own for the last few years. And it just, they've had, boy, for a team that went 13-0, they've had a rough stretch, haven't they? They've had a rough stretch the last 9+ months here. It's been tough. But yeah, you saw the thing that I found interesting about that game is that Georgia Tech really just beat them up. They just beat them up, and they were physical. I love the clip with Key after the game where he just said, "Run the ball, run the ball,
run the ball."
It's just they kept it simple, and they really didn't have to do much. And really, you knew DJU had some limitations, but he looked extremely limited on Saturday. You got to think there's going to be a little more pop to that offense at some point. But hey. We're sitting here. We're about to talk about Florida, Miami. I know there's some other interesting games. You got LSU going against USC, Georgia, Clemson, A&M, Notre Dame. You got some big games throughout the SEC this week. It really shows you how much of a crapshoot that week 1 is, and you don't get a preseason in college football. You got to be ready to go, and all cylinders right out the gate.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, so before we get into more of the matchup, Florida, Miami, but what's just. I know this is always a hard question to answer, but just the current mood of Gator Nation, because just my read on it, you would know better than I. That's why I'm asking you. But it just seems like Florida fans maybe by the end of last season, just like a lot of SEC fans, if your season doesn't go your way, you're out, you're mad. But now it's football time. Everybody's back in. Is it overall consensus that that just basically the overall mood of Gator Nation? I guess is a question.
I know you know the answer to this question, and your Tennessee background makes me think you're asking it because you just want to watch me talk about it. So I'll humor you and answer the question, Mike. But I know you know how we're feeling right now, and we're pissed. It's just been a rough few years ever since that shoe flew through the air in 2020. It's been just been rough, one thing after the other. And we are a team that is young. It was a huge monster rebuild. We can get into that a little bit here because I think there's some parallels with what's going on with Miami as well with that. But it's a bigger rebuild than any of us were hoping to see. And we finally feel like the optimistic side of the fan base, I would say it's definitely split. If you say that, the optimistic side will point to the fact that there's a lot of young talent. There's a lot of question marks right now because we just haven't seen some of it on the field yet. We got a few key transfers in the right spots that seem to be positive. A lot of positivity coming out of camp. The team has been told over and over again. I see you got our magazine in the backdrop there, our Read and Reaction cover. We picked the title Florida versus the World on purpose because we feel like this team, that's got to be the mentality inside the locker room, right? This team has been hearing about it all off season, about how terrible it's been, how terrible they are. When's Billy Napier going to get fired? They've heard all the talk. If that doesn't motivate you as a competitor, I don't know what does. So from a team perspective, hopefully this has brought them closer together. Hopefully this has really got them on edge, ready to go out and compete. But from a fan base perspective, I would say you got part of the fan base is definitely already out on what's going on right now. Part of the fan base is hopeful, but wait and see. And part of the fan base, they're just always going to support no matter what. So I think it's kind of that split across the board. But I would say this result on Saturday will create a shift for sure, one way or the other.
Well, you say Florida versus the world. What about Florida versus special teams? What was your thoughts on this special teams mat when that was debuted?
Florida versus Florida. Florida versus Florida. Well, my first question was, there's only 10 spots on there. And I just brought it. Will Miles and I, my co-host, we were texting back and forth. I was like, there's only 10 spots on that mat. There should be 11. He's like, nobody's ever forgotten the kicker, man. No one's ever forgotten the kicker. And to which case we could say yet. We haven't forgot the kicker yet, but they did bring in a coach from New England to help with the special teams. I think the rule with the analysts being able to be on the field is also a big advantage. We've heard about Billy's Army, and now that those guys are able to be on the field, you'll have more. There'll be no excuses for those types of mistakes this year, where you're having, you're not having the right guys in the right packages, especially on special teams, which is only a few plays a game. You gotta lock that down. But really, what the special teams issues have been overall is they're just symbolic of the bigger problems. They've just been, there's little things that don't go right every single game, it seems like, and that part needs to improve. It's one thing if you don't have the best roster, it's one thing if you don't have the best team on the field even that day. It's another thing to beat yourself. And that's the one thing that in 2023 we saw a lot of games where Florida beat Florida, and so we'd like to see that improve, obviously. So it's not a winning formula.
Right. Well, I know you're not an odds maker, neither am I, Nick, but is the wrong team favored? I'm trying to figure out in this what is arguably the best game of the opening weekend, Miami at Florida, the Hurricanes. I mean, our friends at MyBookie's got Miami as a 2.5 point favorite. That's pretty consensus at this point in time. Is a wrong team favored in your opinion?
Well, I do have Florida. I do have Florida winning this game. Florida getting 2.5 points. The last I saw on the odds on the line there. I think Florida is the smart pick on that. I do think Miami, though, from an objective standpoint, I think Miami has done a ton to flip this roster in Mario Cristobal's 3 years. That's what Mario does well. I think his thing is he's going to recruit. He's going to build up those lines. Both lines, both the trenches are solid for Miami. Especially, I like that offensive front coming in. They got a mix of experience and youth. A lot of talent up front there. And I think I really worry about that matchup the most. That Miami offensive line going against a defensive line that's had a lot of turnover. It's not the same defensive line from last year. We got a couple guys back, but a lot of new guys coming in, and we have some young guys coming in. Hopefully, that can step up. But more hopeful than there's more hope than evidence so far in the Florida defensive front than we've seen on the field. So I do see where you can look at Cam Ward coming in from Washington State. I think that was a huge addition in the portal. Although my co-host Will Miles, he's had some great stats on this here. Van Dyke, who left Miami for Wisconsin in the offseason, he had a QBR of 145.6 in 11 games last season. Cam Ward, 145.4. So the other thing too, Ward, he's got the reputation of being a gunslinger, being out at Washington State and everything, pass-heavy offense. Graham Mertz gets criticized a lot for going downfield. He gets criticized a lot on our show, actually, on Stand Up and Holler for not going downfield enough. But I think that's part of the rebuild that when we first brought Mertz in, I was not excited at all about it. I completely own that. I completely own how I felt about it coming in. His tape at Wisconsin, made a lot of mistakes, was not a guy that you thought was going to be anything other than a one-year stopgap leading into DJ Lagway, hopefully. Well, what Napier did with Mertz, it seemed like he settled him down and he kept him just keep it conservative, keep it easy, don't push it into bad situations. And Mertz throws 3 interceptions all season last season, but the one criticism of him that people consistently had was he wasn't pushing the ball down the field. And he had an adjusted depth of target at ADOT. He had 6.7 yards. Ward's was 7.7. So it's a little further down the field, but for reference, and this is from Will's article this morning up on Read and Reaction, he's got some great previews for the Miami game too. Jackson Dart at Ole Miss and Jaden Daniels at LSU, they had ADOT of closer to 10.5. So Ward is closer to Mertz on that scale. So even though Ward, I think he looks fantastic. I actually watched a clip of all of his snaps from the Oregon State game last year, the Washington State-Oregon State game. They have it up on YouTube. Man, he is accurate. He can extend plays. He can do a lot. He's got a big arm downfield, but he does make mistakes. And I think Florida's defense will have opportunities to make plays and come up with a couple turnovers. That wasn't something that the defense did very well last year, but Cam Ward should provide a couple opportunities with that on Saturday from the optimistic standpoint. From the Miami standpoint, though, I do think that if Miami's clicking on all cylinders, that could be tough for the Gators as well. But you have a lot of new faces. Cam Ward coming in, Martinez coming in from Oregon State. You got a new center coming in from Indiana as well. So that whole structure right there at the core of the offense is brand new. And you're watching Haynes King out in Ireland do this with the headset, right? For those of you who are listening and not viewing, he's got his hands up on his ears, can't hear anything on the headset in Ireland, right? What's that going to be like in the swamp, Mike? What's that going to be like with 90,000 coming down on you in the swamp? And I don't think that's going to be the most ideal setting to start with a brand new offense for Cam Ward.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Nick, because I was going to say that as good as Cam Ward may be, and I honestly I don't know. I don't watch garbage Pac-12 football, but let's say he's fantastic. This is still probably going to be the toughest environment he's ever played in his entire football career, wouldn't you say?
Well, yeah, I'm sure he's played at Oregon. I'm sure he's had some other environments too, but the swamp, I would say, is probably going to be the biggest and the loudest environment that he has yet to see. And I think it's a different level. I've been to some Miami home games. Everyone gives Miami crap for not for nobody going to their games. And I went to the A&M game last year. Happened to go. I live down in Florida, and I happened to pop over. Got some friends over there. We went to the Miami A&M game last year. It was half empty. Like, it's pathetic. You got A&M and Tile. They were offering tickets for people to come to the game. If you buy a ticket for the Miami game, they'll give you one for free for later in the season. Like, it's a you don't have to do that in SEC country. So it is a different level of stadium that they're going to be stepping into. And Miami fans, I've seen them on Twitter. They're like, oh, they're just talking about their stadium. Okay, we'll see on Saturday. We'll see how it is. And I think it's a big deal that you're stepping in. We saw Mertz in his first game with Florida go into Utah, and go watch the first few drives where you had a transfer offensive lineman jump off sides, jump the count a few times. You had plenty of mistakes on those first few drives because it's their first drive they're ever doing together out in Utah, where it's, Utah, I know we're in the SEC country, but Utah, that home field advantage in Utah is pretty good too. So you don't want to really go on a road your first game, yet alone into a primetime environment like the Swamp.
Yeah, no doubt. And with so many new pieces, operational issues are going to arise unless Miami's just flawless out the gate, which I don't see. But so you've kind of already alluded to this. You think Florida can cause some turnovers. What's your overall expectations? Maybe not just for the season overall, but just for this week one matchup against Miami. What's your expectations with how the Florida defense will look?
Yeah, Mike, I'm gonna say I don't think they're gonna cause turnovers. I'm gonna hope that they're gonna cause turnovers because I haven't seen it. I'm at a point where I need to see the evidence. I need to see this on the field. Will and I had a joke all offseason that we got to stop saying that it can't get worse on defense, because it can't. It has, and we have seen a defense that just does not tackle well, particularly on the back end. The linebackers struggled last year, but the back end was just bleak in tackling. And I remember watching a few games against some other SEC opponents where the corners would step up and make a tackle, and I'm like, man, I remember those days. I remember what it was like to watch your corner just step up and cleanly make a tackle on the first attempt. And they brought in Will Harris from the pro ranks again here. I think he's with the Chargers, but he used to be with Washington a couple of years ago. But one of the guys he had coached was Asa Turner, which is a safety that's coming over from Washington. Injury plagued a little bit. Played 4 games last year, but can hit. He's a safety that's going to set the tone. So we know that safety spot. Jordan Castell, freshman All-America last year, played a lot of football. We had a lot of young guys play football for us last year, and I think that you will see an improvement out there. They have stress tackling all off season. So I'm falling back into it. Hey, it's right before kickoff the first week. We can still lie to ourselves a little bit here. I got to think we're going to improve in this area, Mike. I got to think it's going to be a little better. But the other thing they did in the offseason that was heavily featured in the magazine was they brought in Ron Roberts. They brought in Ron Roberts from Auburn, and he had a short stint with Baylor, short stint with Auburn. But he has connections to this staff dating back to the Louisiana days. And we had a young hire a year ago in Austin Armstrong. And Armstrong was known for his aggressiveness at Southern Miss. And when it works, it's excellent. He's got all types of disguised blitzes and everything. You don't know where the pressure is coming from. It looks good when it works. But they do surrender a lot of deep balls off of that aggression. And so hopefully bringing in a mentor, he's got a good relationship, a previous relationship with Roberts. Hopefully that can maybe settle them down a little bit, stay back in coverage. We brought some transfers in the secondary as well. Hopefully you're a little deeper, a little more veteran experience back there, and it's going to look better this season. That's the hope in the secondary. From a linebacker standpoint, I think we had a lot of turnover in the linebacker room here, but the real key was Shamar James was injured last year. He got injured, and we didn't have him that whole back half of the season, and that really killed the little bit of positive part you saw in the defense in the front half of the season. James was playing. Defense fell off big time after James, and if he can play and be that key guy in the middle for the Gators, I think we can definitely see an improvement in the defense this season.
What matchup do you think favors Florida the most in this Miami game?
Yeah, I'd have to lean toward the wide receiver room, Mike. This is something that we brought in Elijah Badger from Arizona State. We brought in DK from Wisconsin, and we have Eugene Wilson, Trey Wilson the third coming back here for another season. So we do also have a tight end in Arliss Borningham that was pretty solid before he was injured last season. He got injured during that Arkansas game. So he had a 5-game stretch there where he was just kind of on fire. He was a pretty steady target for Graham Mertz. So we haven't had that any type of weapon at the tight end spot after Kyle Pitts. So it's going to be good to see him back in action, along with some good pickups in the transfer portal. Particularly interested in seeing if Elijah Badger can have an impact early on. But this Miami secondary is it's a unit that's really it's a unit that's turned over significantly, and we haven't seen it on the field with them. I do think there's a chance to expose them if we get some time in the passing game. I think Miami's got a good defensive front, and I think they're going to test our offensive line. So if our offensive line can hold up against that pass rush, I do think that we have the wide receivers to test their secondary.
Now, what about the reverse, though? Anywhere that Florida may be weak, that Miami is particularly strong, that is a major concern in this matchup?
Yeah, and again, what they say, football is won in the trenches. I do think in the trenches right now, we have more unproven talent than Miami does. I think Miami's got some young guys. They got potential too, but I do think we've seen it from like a guy like Ruben Bain, right? We've seen on their offensive line, we've seen some guys. I know they got Rivers at the left tackle. Malgo is coming back for a second year. They're going to be starting Okunlola, who was a 5-star player at guard. And Carpenter had a good career up at Indiana coming over. Again, first game with those guys, but a lot of talent. I know Inez Cooper, too, is the other guard there for Miami. He's a good player. A lot of good players on that offensive front. I really would stress in the trenches on both sides of the ball. I think Florida has something to prove going up here against Miami.
And do you buy the narrative that this could be the defining game of the Billy Napier era, or do you look at games like, his first one, beat Utah? That was a hell of a win, but obviously season kind of went sideways after that. Last season, a lot of people when they beat Tennessee, they said, all right, that's the turning point right there. And believe me, we haven't forgotten on Rocky Top. Shane's still bitching about the 17 miles he had to walk after that game. But, do you buy this being the critical game, or do you think, even if hopefully the Gators, don't lose, but if they do, could they rebound because it's not even a SEC game?
Well, from a media standpoint, it is fun to hype up, right? It's fun to look at this game and talk. You see the storylines coming in are awesome. You got 2 in-state rivals. We don't play every year. We don't like each other. We do not like each other. I want to stress that. Florida, Miami, I don't want to hear it from Miami fans after this. Miami fans, they win the offseason every year. Miami's back by August 31st every single season. And then between August and December, it's not always so good for them. But you do have to think at some point they're going to be back to some degree, right? Mario Cristobal coming in, building that roster up. Year 3, ton of turnover. Same thing for Billy Napier. Ton of turnover, but 82% of the guys on this roster as of the time writing the magazine in the spring, I know that number's only gone up, 82% were Billy Napier players. So this is Billy Napier's team, and this is a chance for him to make a statement, and there's a lot of doubters right now for Billy Napier. If you come out, you win this game, it's a chance to silence the doubters for 2 weeks, and then Texas A&M comes to town. So that's the thing. If you beat Miami, you lose to A&M. Well, who cares? You lost your first SEC game, right? You lost their first-year head coach. So while it is a big game, and it will put people in a good mood for 2 weeks, it's something that we build up because we got all offseason to talk about, in my opinion. But it will set the tone early for Napier, and that's where I think it's important for Napier is to set the tone early in the right direction. And you got to start seeing it on the field. There's a lot of positivity off the field for some of the players they've recruited, for some of the guys coming in like a Lagway. There's a lot of good young players. You got a linebacker, you got Aaron Childs coming in. A lot of enthusiasm with some of these transfers coming in too. but you got to see it on the field. It's nice to talk about. You got to see it. And I would say Miami's very much in the same boat. So crystal ball, though, is very different. I think he's far more secure. And I think they got an ACC schedule on the back end where I think their toughest games are like Virginia Tech and Florida State. They should win 9 games easy. So from a playoff standpoint, I've said to Will before, with our schedule this year in 2024, I know we heard Cole Kubelik use the phrase logo fever. I love that. It's been a little bit of logo fever because you don't know what these teams are going to be. Florida State is one of those 5 games on the back end. For those of you who don't know, it's Georgia at Texas, LSU, Ole Miss at Florida State on the back end for the Gators. Well, that Florida State game looks a lot different after that Georgia Tech outing, right? So that looks like a game you can go out and, we expect to compete against Florida State anyway. So they could have beat Georgia Tech 40-0. We'd still expect to compete against Florida State. But you want to see Napier step out in the field, get things done, and you want to see it. You can only go 1 week at a time, right, Mike? You can only go one week at a time with this. So you beat Miami, you set the tone for that first half of the season potentially. You get people on board this season. You see, okay, yeah, some of those young guys did make plays. It's not just talk. It's actually showing up on the field. And I think that would go a long way with the fan base because that back half of the season, even though it is a little bit of logo fever, it is tough. It is a tough stretch of schedule. And we saw last year, we lost the last 5 last year. We started 5-2 last year. Some people might forget that who don't follow Florida closely. This team started 5-2 and finished 5-7. So it's been a minute since we've won a game, yet alone had a winning season. So we need to go out here and we step out and we create a optimistic moment in the first part of the season here for Billy Napier. I think that's going to go a long way to silencing some of the critics. But he's got a lot to prove, Mike. So it's not just going. He could come out and crush Miami and then put up another 500 season. The same people are going to be talking. But I do think that unless there's a definitive answer post Billy Napier, like I don't think the administration is going to be in a rush to make a decision. So some people in the fan base will say like, yeah, you either want to see them win 10 games or lose, 9, something like that. We want to have an answer one way or another this year and not in the middle. But hey, it is a tough slate. It is a tough schedule, but there is a scenario out there where Florida, this first half of the schedule, could jump out to a fast start and then surprise in a couple games late. And next thing you know, you're sitting at 7-9 wins.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think it's that unrealistic, Nick. If they come out here and they whoop Miami, which I think they certainly could, and from Florida State losing week 0, perception after so much negativity nationally that Florida is viewed as the best program in the state. I mean, that's not super far-fetched, do you think?
Well, we're going to test that theory because UCF comes to town October 5th, and we got Florida State at the end of the year, so we're going to play them all. We're going to play them all, and then you're not even talking about the dark horse in the G5 playoff spot in USF, so they could jump in. They're playing Miami in a couple weeks too. So no, it is amazing how quickly that pendulum can swing, right? Like when Florida won, I was in school back during the Meyer days when Florida won the title in 08. Florida State was so down at the time, and Miami couldn't figure it out. Well, 5 years later, Jameis is hoisting the national championship. Like things can change so fast, and that's what. But you need to see it on the field. You need to see it on the field, and so we're at a point where the fact is these are 2 great logos getting together on Saturday. Not a lot of people have accomplished anything in them on either sideline. So there's a lot to prove on both sides coming into this game, and I think that particularly from the Florida side, I think the heat it's a little hotter on the Florida sideline because you don't have that ACC schedule that goes through after. So this is one of those games we look at on the schedule and go, we got to get this one. We have to get this one, and especially with it being in the swamp. We still are tough in the swamp. We're still a ball club to contend with in the swamp. We saw Tennessee Vols come in last year. We saw Utah come in 2 years ago and fall on opening day. So we could still take care of things in the swamp, and that's something where you got to take care of that home field.
How much do you think we see DJ Lagway this season, and do we see him at all? You think in the opener?
So I asked the same question on our show the other night. I said over or under 9.5 snaps on the game. And, I'm thinking about that 9.5. If you hit the over, you're probably seeing him in some run situations like Tebow in 2006 where you come in on that, 3rd and 3 or it's 4th and 1. goal line package, something like that, and there's like a 2% chance he's going to pass the ball, but he's going to run some kind of read, or either hand it off on the right read, or take it himself. But he is big, he is physical, he can move. I would like to think that we're going to see him out there in some capacity, but that is something that Napier's not giving any insight on that. So that's one of those things we're all going to find out together on Saturday. But you would think it's not like Mertz is a mobile quarterback, right? So he brings such a different skill set to the table that I think you can really complement him with Mertz in some ways, and I do think there is a role for him. I took the over on 9.5 snaps for the record, but that's a total guess. We'll see what happens on Saturday. But either way, you're going to see him a bunch the whole next week against Samford. So you'll see him. You'll get to see a lot of DJ Lagway in the next couple of weeks.
All right, last thing for you, Nick. Really appreciate your time, but any can we pin you down to a season record prediction for Florida? And I want to hold it to you because, again, this week one will probably dictate. You'll probably go 10-2 if they whoop them. You'll probably go 3-9 if they lose. What's your thoughts on Florida season record prediction?
Well, I do think the realistic is somewhere in the middle. I think you're looking at a 6-6, a 7-5. Like, I think on the optimistic end, you could get to 8 wins. I think 8 wins would be really solid, a really solid performance. But I think six is probably what you're looking at overall. So you'll probably lose one game you shouldn't. You'll probably win one game you shouldn't, right? Somewhere along the way. And I think that 6-6, and nobody's going to be happy with that record. But my thing is this, Mike, with the transfer portal in place, when you make coaching changes, you got to think about what you're throwing out the door. And I think you got a guy in place like Lagway. It's hard for me to sit here and say, like, if we don't get a full shot of what he is this season, which I think you got to come out of this season with an answer. If you are in that middle range, we got to see a lot of DJ Lagway down the stretch to see if he's that guy. And if he is that guy, like, I think you have to keep things tight for another year. I do think that's not a pass for Napier. That's not a like. Hey, like I said, at some point you got to prove it. You got to show it on the field. But I do think that there are enough young talent, young pieces coming in. He landed Vernell Brown III out of Orlando, big wide receiver. Nashawn Montgomery just committed the other day at wide receiver. We got some good receivers on campus already. We got a young guy named Tank Hawkins, a freshman. That's going to be very interesting. We got a couple of young guys that haven't quite made it into the rotation that have solid potential at receiver. This receiver group looks a lot different than it did a couple of years ago. But if you change the coaches out, how much of that do you lose? And what have we been building for the last few years? So I do think that people don't want to hear it, but I do think some patience is required. And I don't think that's going to be a popular take among Gator fans. But unless you have that great answer, and firing the coach is the answer, I don't think you go back to that well again for a little bit. I think you work out some of the problems within the program, which I think Napier has done. And I think it's been a bigger rebuild than he was hoping for, that any of us were hoping for. And I do think we have to finish out this season at least. And then I would say we'll have a clear answer by Georgia next year. I think you have your clear answer by Georgia next year, which might be longer than some people want to wait. But I do think you got to be smart about this in the transfer portal era, because rosters can flip over so quick. And if you don't get the perfect coach next time, then we're just going to be living in this cycle for the next 3 years. So it's like, that's the part I worry about, is jumping the gun on anything. I certainly, for the Billy Napier critics out there, like, it's like I said, like, I look at Billy Napier critics, they'll say something, I'll be like, yeah, it's a good point. You got a point. So I'm not defending him. But on the other hand, I'm like, so if we're so great, if fire the coach is the answer, then why haven't we gotten that right the last 4 times? Nobody stops to answer that question, but it's something that I think that there are enough young pieces in place that you look a few years down the road and you go, yeah, I can see this becoming a team. I can see this being something that is going to be really solid, but you'd like to see them step up and start making plays as soon as possible, obviously. And I definitely think that this is going in a direction that on paper looks like it's pretty good, but again, you got do I sound confident, Mike? Do I sound confident in that assessment? Like, it's not. I got to see it at some point. You got to see it, and so it is a tricky question. It is going to be something to watch throughout the season. It's definitely a storyline to watch throughout the season, but I do think you got to have some caution with it.
Right, and just to your point, something you didn't even mention, but everybody with these coaching searches, everybody's got their candidate, the guy they want. You rarely get the guy you want. I mean, I don't even think Alabama just did. I don't think Texas A&M did, and I'm not saying Florida can't, but I don't know. It's usually option 2, option 3, and sometimes, believe me, I've seen Jeremy Pruitt get hired at Tennessee. He was about option 50. You know what I mean?
Right.
So,
right. Tennessee's a great example of a program that's just cycled through them. And Josh Heupel was not anybody that was 100% well received when he was first hired. And honestly, probably was a fallback plan for Danny White, who had just come up from UCF. And people at UCF were like, well, is the recruiting falling off? Are we falling off? Like, people at UCF felt like they were falling off, so they weren't crushed that Heupel left. And then he goes up to Tennessee and produces couple of the best seasons you guys have seen in a long time. So it's really, I think it's the structure behind the coaches that doesn't get enough talk sometimes in the media, obviously, because you don't have all that information from a media standpoint, right? So it's speculation. But I do think that there's been a commitment off the field from Florida that wasn't there under other previous administrations. I mean, something even Jim McElwain used to complain a lot about some of the stuff. We just built a facility, Mike. I think Tennessee built one in 1993. Like we're our attitude for years has been we're Florida. Like we're people come play ball here. Like we're gonna figure it out. There's plenty of talent. And so we've been slow to adapt in some ways off the field. And it's I don't think we just hired 4 terrible coaches in a row. I think there's other stuff going on. Why are we getting crushed by Georgia in major head-to-head recruiting battles for the last 10 years? That's why has Alabama been dominating for so long? We're in the SEC too, right? You don't just get it you don't just get to point to Alabama and take credit for that. You're just letting that happen. That's happening under your watch at Florida. They're dominating in part because you're down, right? So you got to get back on. I look at Florida as a program that's capable of winning national championships, and you have to be able to go out and compete on all angles. And that is something I do think that Napier is doing a good job of behind the scenes, is putting some of those pieces together. But the problem is, Mike, we've had there's been too many times where you just see one positive story and 2 negative. And then even some of the off the field stuff, the Rashada thing with the NIL we just get too many embarrassing stories that pop out that just kill the momentum in being overly positive about the program at the moment. But that's a lot of this will be fixed if you just start winning on the field, and we don't have to talk about any of that. So just start winning on the field, and a lot of these other problems get solved.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, thanks again, Nick, for joining the show. Before you go, can you tell the audience how can they follow you and how can they find your work?
Yeah, I'm with readandreaction.com. Just check out our blogs. We got Will Miles is the founder for the site and does a great job. And we also do a show called Stand Up and Holler on YouTube. Every off season we do a magazine, the Read and Reaction Preview magazine too. But I'm also on Twitter. I don't tweet a ton. I don't have Mike's Twitter game, but I'm at Nick Knudsen FB on Twitter. If anyone wants to follow. So, but Read and Reaction, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want weekly Florida Gators content.